I always thought the legends were just stories, meant to spook and entertain. But when I received an invitation to spend a night at the infamous Lizzie Borden House, I couldn't resist. As an avid seeker of the supernatural, I knew this was a chance I couldn't pass up. The house, now a bed and breakfast, had a reputation for ghostly encounters and eerie happenings. I packed my bags, equipped with a camera and a recorder, ready to document anything that might happen. The drive to Fall River, Massachusetts was uneventful, but the sight of the Borden House sent a chill down my spine. The Victorian-style home stood solemnly, as if it were frozen in time. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the smell of old wood and a faint hint of lavender. The innkeeper, a kind but serious woman named Mrs. Harrington, welcomed me warmly. Her eyes held the weight of countless stories. "You must be the ghost hunter," she said with a slight smile. "We've had quite a few of you stay here. Some leave satisfied, others, not so much." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. "I'm here to see if there's any truth to the tales." Mrs. Harrington led me to my room on the second floor, the same floor where Lizzie's parents had met their gruesome end. The room was quaint, with period furnishings and a large, four-poster bed. The wallpaper, patterned with roses, seemed to hold whispers from the past. She handed me a key and a flashlight, her face serious now. "Lights out at 11. We don't want to disturb the other guests. But be careful where you tread. This house has its peculiarities." I thanked her and set about unpacking my gear. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the floor, I began to feel the weight of the house's history. I wandered the halls, taking photos and jotting down notes. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind outside, seemed to carry a story. At dinner, I met the other guests. A young couple on a dare, an older man researching a book, and a woman who claimed to be a medium. The conversation was lively, filled with laughter and ghost stories. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease. After dinner, I returned to my room, preparing for the night ahead. I set up my camera and recorder, positioning them to capture any movement or sound. As the clock struck 11, the house fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I lay in bed, the flashlight within reach, my heart pounding with anticipation. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to doze off, a cold breeze swept through the room. I sat up, every nerve on edge. The temperature had dropped noticeably. My breath came out in puffs of white mist. Then, I heard it. Soft footsteps, moving slowly down the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and camera, creeping towards the door. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside my room. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I stepped out, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The silence was deafening. As I turned to head back to my room, I caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hall. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. It stood there, motionless, watching me. My heart raced as I lifted the camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the hallway, and for a brief moment, I saw it clearly. A woman in a long, old-fashioned dress, her face pale and expressionless. And then she was gone, vanished into thin air. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Had I really seen what I thought I had? The camera in my hands felt heavy with the evidence. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. As I reviewed the photo, my blood ran cold. There she was, unmistakable and eerie. The legends were true. The Lizzie Borden house was haunted. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sunlight streaming through the curtains did little to dispel the lingering unease from the night before. Determined to uncover more, I headed downstairs for breakfast. The other guests were already seated, their faces showing varying degrees of apprehension and curiosity. The medium, Claire, looked particularly unsettled. "Did anyone else experience anything last night?" she asked, her voice a whisper. I nodded, recounting my encounter in the hallway. The young couple, Jake and Emily, exchanged nervous glances. "We heard footsteps too," Emily said. "But we thought it was just the old house settling." The older man, Professor Thompson, was more skeptical. "I didn't hear a thing," he said, sipping his coffee. "But I'm here to observe and record, not to jump to conclusions." Mrs. Harrington served breakfast with a knowing smile. "The spirits here are restless," she said. "Especially when there are new guests. They like to make their presence known." As we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After breakfast, I decided to explore the house further. Claire offered to join me, eager to use her abilities to communicate with the spirits. We started in the parlor, where Lizzie had been questioned by the police. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick with history. Claire closed her eyes, her face tense with concentration. "There's a presence here," she said softly. A woman, angry, confused. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Lizzie?" Claire nodded. "I think so. She's trying to tell us something." We moved to the sitting room, where Lizzie's stepmother, Abby Borden, had been found. The atmosphere was even heavier here. Claire placed her hand on the spot where Abby's body had lain, her eyes wide with fear. "She's here too," Claire whispered. "She's in pain, so much pain." Suddenly, the room grew colder. I could see my breath again. Claire's eyes snapped open, filled with terror. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Something doesn't want us here." We hurried back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Harrington was tidying up. She looked up, her expression serious. "You felt it, haven't you?" I nodded. "This house is more than just haunted. It's angry." Mrs. Harrington sighed. "The spirits here have never been at peace. The tragedy that occurred within these walls has left a mark that can never be erased." As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The other guests were similarly unsettled. Emily and Jake decided to leave early, unable to handle the oppressive atmosphere. Professor Thompson, however, remained resolute, determined to gather more evidence. That night, as I prepared for another sleepless vigil, I heard a knock on my door. It was Claire. "I want to try something," she said. "A seance. Maybe we can communicate with the spirits, understand what they want." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. "All right. Let's do it." We gathered in the parlor, where Claire set up candles and a small table. Professor Thompson joined us, his skepticism clear but his curiosity piqued. As we sat around the table, holding hands, Claire began to chant softly. "Spirits of the Borden House, we seek to understand your pain. Show us the truth. Help us see what you see." The candles flickered, and the room grew colder. Suddenly, the table shook, and a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. In the darkness, I heard a whisper, barely audible. "Help us." The voice was filled with anguish, sending a shiver down my spine. Claire's grip tightened on my hand. "We're here to help," she said. "Tell us what happened. Show us the truth." The room was filled with a palpable sense of sorrow and anger. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I knew then that this was just the beginning. The spirits of the Lizzie Borden house had a story to tell, and we were about to uncover it. The next morning, I awoke feeling more determined than ever. The experience during the seance had left us all shaken but with a clear sense of purpose. The spirits needed help, and I was intent on finding out how. Over breakfast, Professor Thompson reviewed the audio recordings from the night before. His usually skeptical demeanor was replaced by a quiet focus. "There's definitely something here," he said, playing back the recording. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. "Help us." We decided to explore the attic, a place where guests rarely ventured. Mrs. Harrington had mentioned that strange noises often came from there, but no one had dared to investigate thoroughly. Claire, Professor Thompson, and I made our way up the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dimly lit by a single, dusty window. Cobwebs draped the corners, and old furniture lay covered in white sheets. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive silence. Claire closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses. "There's a strong presence here," she murmured. "It's different from the others. Older." We began to sift through the forgotten relics, hoping to uncover something that might explain the restless spirits. I found an old trunk, its lock rusted but breakable. Inside, we discovered a collection of letters and photographs, yellowed with age. One photo caught my eye. It was a family portrait of the Bordens, taken before the murders. Lizzie stood apart from the others, her expression unreadable. Claire picked up a letter, her face growing pale as she read. "This is from Lizzie to a friend. She talks about feeling watched, about strange occurrences in the house. Even before the murders, something was wrong here." Professor Thompson nodded, examining another letter. "It's possible that the house itself has always been a focal point for supernatural activity. The murders might have just intensified it." As we continued to search, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged in the cold air, and a sense of dread washed over me. Claire's eyes widened in alarm. It's here, she whispered. Something very old, very powerful. The attic door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The room grew darker, the shadows deepening. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and ethereal. It was not like the woman I had seen in the hallway. This presence was malevolent, its anger palpable. "You shouldn't be here," the voice growled, echoing through the attic. We stood frozen, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on us. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're here to help. Tell us what you want." The figure's form flickered, revealing glimpses of a man in old-fashioned clothing. His eyes were dark, filled with a hatred that chilled me to the bone. "You cannot help. Leave, or suffer." With a final, chilling glare, the figure vanished, and the attic door creaked open. We stumbled out, our hearts pounding. Back in the safety of the hallway, we exchanged glances, the gravity of our situation sinking in. Mrs. Harrington was waiting for us at the bottom of the stairs. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she asked, her voice grave. I nodded. "Who is he?" "Some say he was a previous owner, long before the Bordens. A man who dabbled in dark practices. His spirit has never left." Claire shuddered. "He's powerful. And very angry." Professor Thompson looked determined. "We need to find a way to help these spirits find peace. The more we uncover, the closer we get to understanding how." As night fell once again, we prepared for what lay ahead. The Lizzie Borden house was a place of deep, unresolved pain. The spirits within its walls were crying out for help, and we were their only hope. This was no longer just an investigation, it was a mission to bring peace to the restless souls trapped in this haunted house. The night descended with an unsettling quiet. Every creak of the house seemed amplified in the stillness. Claire and I decided to set up our base of operations in the sitting room where Abby Borden had been found. The weight of history pressed heavily upon us, but we were resolute. We needed answers. We spread out the letters and photographs from the attic, hoping to piece together the puzzle. As we examined the documents, a pattern began to emerge. Lizzie's letters mentioned a recurring figure, a man she saw in her dreams and occasionally felt watching her in the house. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this could be the same malevolent spirit we encountered in the attic. Claire's face grew pale as she read a particularly disturbing passage. Lizzie wrote about hearing whispers in the night, urging her to do unspeakable things. She felt as if she were losing her mind. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the candles flickered. We exchanged nervous glances. The house seemed to be reacting to our discoveries. A low, mournful wail echoed through the hallways, sending a shiver down my spine. Professor Thompson entered the room, carrying a book he had found in the library. "I think I found something," he said, his voice tense. He opened the book to a section detailing the house's history long before the Borden family. It spoke of a man named Jonathan Crow, a recluse who was rumored to practice dark rituals. "He disappeared under mysterious circumstances," Professor Thompson continued. "Some say he was driven mad by the entities he conjured." Claire's eyes widened. "That's him. That's the spirit we saw in the attic." I felt a sense of dread wash over me. If Jonathan Crow had truly summoned something dark, it could explain the malevolent presence in the house. The spirits of the Bordens were not just restless, they were tormented by something far more sinister. We decided to confront the entity directly. Armed with the knowledge from the book and the letters, we prepared for another seance. This time, we would not be seeking to communicate but to confront and, if possible, banish the dark presence. As we gathered in the parlor, the atmosphere grew tense. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Claire began to chant, calling upon the spirits of the house. "Jonathan Crow, we command you to show yourself. Reveal your intentions." The room grew colder, and a gust of wind blew through, extinguishing the candles. In the darkness, we heard the same growling voice from the attic. "You dare." The figure appeared, more solid than before. His eyes burned with anger. "You cannot banish me. This house is mine." Claire stood her ground, her voice steady. "You are not welcome here. Release the spirits you torment. Let them find peace." The figure laughed, a sound filled with malice. "They are mine. Forever." I felt a surge of determination. "No. They deserve peace. They deserve to be free from your darkness." The entity's form flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hint of fear in his eyes. Claire continued to chant, her voice growing stronger. The air crackled with energy, and the figure began to waver. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room. The figure let out a scream of rage and pain, dissolving into the light. The oppressive weight lifted, and the room grew warmer. We stood there, catching our breath. The atmosphere was noticeably lighter. The spirits of the house seemed to sigh with relief. Mrs. Harrington entered the room, her eyes wide with amazement. "What happened?" "We confronted him," I said. "I think we may have banished Jonathan Crow." Claire nodded, her face pale but determined. "The spirits are still here, but they are no longer tormented. They might finally find peace." As we packed up our equipment, I felt a sense of closure. The Lizzie Borden house would always be a place of tragedy, but perhaps now, it could also be a place of healing. The spirits had told their story, and we had listened. And yet, as we left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The house still held many secrets, and the spirits within would always be a part of its history. But for now, at least, the darkness had been lifted. Despite the apparent victory over Jonathan Crow's dark presence, the Borden house still felt heavy with unspoken secrets. Claire, Professor Thompson, and I decided to stay one more night. We needed to ensure the spirits had truly found peace. As night fell, a thick fog enveloped the house, adding to its eerie ambience. We gathered in the dining room, reviewing our findings. Claire suggested a final walkthrough of the house, sensing there were still threads left to untangle. We began our tour in the basement, a place rarely explored. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with shelves holding old jars and tools. As we moved deeper into the basement, the temperature dropped, and the sense of being watched returned. "I can feel them," Claire whispered. "They're still here, but quieter." We found an old wooden chest tucked away in a corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside were personal items belonging to the Bordens, old letters, diaries, and even a few trinkets. One diary, in particular, caught our attention. It belonged to Lizzie. The pages were filled with her thoughts, her fears, and her growing paranoia about being watched and controlled by an unseen force. It became clear that Lizzie was not only haunted by external spirits but also by the darkness that had seeped into her mind. "This explains so much," Professor Thompson said, his voice hushed. Lizzie was tormented by something far more sinister than we ever imagined. We brought the diary upstairs, hoping to piece together the final parts of the story. As we read, the house began to creak and groan, as if it were coming alive. The air grew colder, and we heard faint whispers. "Help us. Please." Claire's eyes widened. "They're trying to communicate. We need to listen." Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and the candles flickered violently. The atmosphere became oppressive once more. It felt as if the house was reacting to our intrusion, demanding that we leave or face its wrath. We decided to conduct one last séance, this time in the sitting room where Abby Borden had been found. As we held hands around the table, Claire called out to the spirits. "Spirits of the Borden house, we have heard your cries. Show us what you need. Help us understand your pain." The room grew icy cold, and a thick, oppressive silence settled over us. The table shook, and we saw shadows moving in the corners of the room. A mist began to form in the center of the table, taking the shape of Abby Borden. Her face was contorted with pain and fear. "Release us," she whispered. "He still holds us." In darkness. A sudden realization hit me. Jonathan Crow's influence isn't entirely gone. He still has a hold on the spirits. Claire's eyes were filled with determination. "We need to break his hold completely." We focused our energy, calling upon the light and the power of the spirits of the house. The room filled with a bright, warm light, and we chanted together, demanding that Jonathan Crow's hold be broken. The shadows writhed and twisted, and we heard a final, agonizing scream. The light grew brighter until it was blinding. When it finally faded, the oppressive weight lifted entirely. Abby's form became clearer, her expression now peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away completely. The house was silent once more, but this time, it was a peaceful silence. We knew that the spirits had finally found the release they sought. As we packed our things, the sense of closure was overwhelming. Mrs. Harrington thanked us, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given them peace. This house can finally rest." As we left the Lizzie Borden house, the fog lifted, revealing a clear night sky. The house stood as a monument to its dark history, but now it also stood as a place where spirits had found peace. And while the house still held many secrets, we knew that we had done our part. The spirits of the Borden house had told their story, and we had listened. The darkness was gone, and for the first time in decades, the house was truly at peace. But I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey with the supernatural was far from over. There were other stories, other haunted places, and other spirits waiting to be heard. And as we drove away, I felt a sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. Returning to the Borden house the following year was a decision fueled by curiosity and a sense of unfinished business. Despite the peace we had seemingly brought, whispers from the house had reached us. New guests reported strange occurrences, and Mrs. Harrington had sent us a desperate letter, urging us to return. The house loomed in the distance as we approached, looking unchanged yet holding an air of expectancy. Claire, Professor Thompson, and I stepped inside, greeted by Mrs. Harrington's anxious face. "Thank goodness you're here," she said. It started again. Different this time, but equally unsettling. We settled in, the familiar creaks and whispers now oddly comforting. Claire immediately sensed the change. The spirits are different. Less tormented, but there's something new. Something searching. We decided to start in the attic, where Jonathan Crow's presence had been strongest. The air was thick with anticipation. As we set up our equipment, Claire's eyes widened. "There's someone here," she whispered. "Someone who doesn't belong." A cold wind swept through the attic, and an ethereal figure appeared, a young girl, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered. "I'm lost." This was new. The Borden spirits had never appeared so clearly. "Who are you?" I asked gently. "My name is Sarah. I was here long before the Bordens. I can't find my way out." Professor Thompson looked puzzled. "She's not from the Borden era. This house's history goes deeper than we thought." We followed Sarah's apparition as she led us to the basement. She pointed to a corner where the floorboards looked newer than the rest. With some effort, we pried them up, revealing an old, dusty box. Inside were children's toys, a small dress, and a locket. "This is where I was hidden," Sarah said softly. "I was forgotten." The air grew heavy with sorrow. Claire reached out, her voice soothing. "We remember you now, Sarah. We'll help you find peace." We conducted a séance, focusing on Sarah's story. The house responded with a warmth we hadn't felt before. Sarah's spirit glowed softly, her expression one of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, fading away. As the night deepened, we realized Sarah's presence had awakened something else. The house felt alive, buzzing with energy. We returned to the parlor, the heart of the house's history. "We need to address the house itself," Claire said. "There's more here, layers upon layers of history and pain." We joined hands, calling upon all the spirits of the Borden house. "We seek to understand your stories. Show us what we need to see." The room filled with light, and visions flashed before our eyes, glimpses of the house's past, from its construction to its various inhabitants. Each spirit, each story, layered upon the next, creating a tapestry of sorrow, joy, fear, and love. And then, we saw it. The true heart of the house, an ancient tree, long since gone but whose roots still ran deep beneath the foundation. The tree had witnessed everything, absorbed the energy, and held the spirits close. "We need to heal the roots," Claire said. "Only then can the house truly be at peace." We gathered around the spot where the tree once stood, channeling our energy into the ground. The house groaned, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. But then, a warmth spread through the floor, up the walls, and into the air. A chorus of voices, no longer tormented but harmonious, filled the room. The spirits were singing, their collective relief palpable. The light grew brighter, enveloping us in a comforting embrace. When it faded, the house was still. Peaceful. We knew the spirits had finally found their rest. Mrs. Harrington met us in the hallway, tears in her eyes. "You've done it. They're at peace. Truly, finally at peace." As we left the Lizzie Borden house for the last time, I felt a profound sense of closure. The house, with all its history and pain, had finally found peace. And so had we. Our journey with the supernatural wasn't over, but this chapter had reached its end. We drove away, the house a silhouette in the rearview mirror, ready for whatever stories awaited us next.